Hi, this is Nick from NXC Plants, and today I'm going to be talking a bit about how I grow my Anthurium. To start out, I keep my Anthurium in grow tents from the brand Gorilla Grow, and I keep them under LED lights in sort of a passive hydroponics system using a 3-part nutrient solution plus CalMag and silica and some other additives, but I'll go more in depth into my nutrient solution in another video. Okay, so we're over here at the tent where I grow most of those plants that I showed last week, and this is a standard 4x4 grow tent. It's actually 8 feet tall with its lift, which lets me put a 6-foot shelf in there and still put things up top. But I'm going to start down here. For those asking about lighting, on this bottom shelf it goes from about 120 ppfd for these ones down here close to the lights, down to about 60 for the big ones at the back there. Also, these plants are on heat mats, mainly through winter, just to prevent some cold damage I can sometimes get on emergent leaves. Then moving up, we've got this shelf, and these ones in the front are again at about 120 ppfd, and you see still get the beautiful dark foliage. And then up here, these guys are a little bit closer to the grow light. I'll show you where those lights are located after we're done here. We have the queens of the pendant species, and these ones are up in about 300 ppfd. And then behind them, there's some of the more green varieties, and they're in about 120. On this shelf, the plants are also on a heat mat. I don't know if you can see back there. Yeah, I'm going to turn and show you the lights. So this is a 46 watt LED light, and its temperature is 6500 Kelvin, which gets you this nice, very natural appearance. And then on the sides, I have 10 watt Barina grow bars down the front legs, just zip tied to the poles. Yeah, that's how I set this tent up. And if you're curious, I run the fan normally when I'm not recording 24/7, and I find I haven't had too many fungal issues with that. So yeah, here's my main grow tent. Today I want to talk more about how I keep the plants physically, sort of how I grow the roots, the pot setups I use, and the substrates I grow in. I think to keep this easy, I'm going to go from smallest to largest. So I'm going to start out with how I germinate seeds and how I grow small Anthurium up to the size that they can leave a prop box. To start out here, we have how we keep our smallest plants, which is just in a prop box. I'm going to show a little bit more inside. You can see we've got a mix of some cuttings of smaller plants and a lot of Anthurium we've grown out from seed or from small seedling. Now, someone commented asking to see some Cunea, and in this row, so right down here, I'm growing some Cunea, and right here I'm growing some Ace of Spades X Cunea from the batch released by Justin Jones. I also got some other interesting stuff in here, but I'll go more into plants like that in a different video, since today I want to focus on sort of how I grow. So in this prop box, I'm going to lift this up. You can see these separate. There's some roots poking out the bottom, that's kind of fun. And I keep a reservoir in the tray below of a very, very, very dilute chemical nutrient solution with some other kelp additives that help with rooting and micronutrients, as well as hormones for the plants so things grow a little bit faster, a little bit hardier, root some more. The substrate is a mix of tree fern fiber, pumice, and perlite. And I like this because it's able to stay wet with a reservoir, and the roots seem to go bananas, and best of all, it's not moss. Here we have the seedling sort of mix we'd use, so you can get an idea of what it looks like. Just a lot of tree fern, pumice, and perlite. The main substrate I grow in is a DIY pond. It's 4 parts perlite to 2 parts pumice to 2 parts lava rock to 1 part fluval stratum. I've had really good luck growing in this mix. I like what each of the components does for the plants, and I find it a pretty cost-competitive alternative to either soil or other soilless substrates. I know a lot of people complain about how expensive fluval is. I find it's pretty comparable to the price of lechuza pond, and it's such a small part of my mix that I find it's worth the investment for the micronutrients it provides to the plants. I think it helps with a lot of gaps in traditional fertilizers. This is the mix I use for probably 90% of my plants, all the way up from when they leave the prop box to my largest pots. I'll grow plants in this mix. The first style of pot I grow in is this little self-watering setup I made out of this black hydroponic net pot a wick, and a 32-ounce food storage container. This is the size I like to use for seedlings that I've just graduated from the pot box. They go from in those little cells into one of these guys. I'm a big fan of wick pots because of the ability to have a consistent moisture level, and I can just fill up a reservoir every couple weeks to a month, depending on the plant. This plant is growing in my DIY pond. You can see good roots developing around the edge of the pot. After the seedlings or whatever goes from this size setup, I take them into one of these pots. These are square self-watering pots I ordered off Amazon. You can see the wicks into the reservoir. This plant is also growing in my pond mix. I've then top dressed it with the same stuff I keep my seedlings in. I like to do this to develop the advantageous roots that start to develop up the stems. This is my favorite plant. I had to show it in this video too. After plants graduate from this size pot, which I usually do once they hit, I find cataphyll is when they're usually starting to get a little bit rooted into the reservoir. I move them into this next size pot, or sometimes even a pot this size. This is an Anthurium Wonder Boy, and I'm once again growing it in my pond mix. But this time, instead of the pot having a distinct net pot that I can lift out, it's an all-in-one. So it can still be drained at the bottom. However, I'm not the biggest fan of this style of pot, and if I had an alternative at the time, I would have pick something different. Not because of any issues I've had, just because of a personal preference for a discrete reservoir with a wick into the growing pot. The reason I'm not a biggest fan of this is even when I added a good leca layer to the bottom with a wick into it, I find it still sits a little bit swampier than I'd like. And if the water level gets too high, I find the pot is pretty full of water, up a little bit higher than I feel comfortable. I don't really like my roots sitting in water and then having that area dry out and then go back to being wet. I find that's the problem. If roots are just sitting in water, I usually don't have an issue. But when you go from wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry is when I find you start to get rot development. And then the next size pot that I do sometimes go from this square pot over here to one of these guys is this big hydroponic net pot into a 3-gallon bucket. This is the size I like to use for my larger plants or the ones with a more mature root system. This is the first plant of this size that isn't in a pond mix. It's in a mix of tree fern, pond, and some other stuff that I'll talk about once I'm done showing how this is set up. Wick into a reservoir. You can see start to get great root development out into the humid air. And again, this just lets these plants put on a huge root system, which is really the only trick to getting bigger leaves or flowers is building a big root system, which is why I'm a big fan of these large aerated pots that have all these holes. A big part of these plants' mass uptake comes from, like almost all of it comes from carbon dioxide, and that is a gas exchange that needs to take place. And that gas exchange takes place in the roots. So the more air you can get into that root system, and the bigger root system you can develop, the more carbon the plant can take in to grow. This is my big boy mix, as I like to call it. It's a mix of tree fern, my pond, and fir bark that you can use to get for like reptiles, all equal parts. This mix is great because it's a very moist but airy mixture, and the bark provides good bulk that won't break down with time and it won't sort of settle out. That's why I like to use this mix on the bigger plants. I add biochar to this as well. It's not quite a ratio, it's 2% by weight is what I like to do. I also add a kelp powder, which aids in root development and speeds that whole thing up. The reason I use this over pond is it sort of doesn't compress as much. So it's a good medium for plants that I'm going to keep long-term in their setups. I'd say like more than a year. And it still keeps all the benefits of my pond with the fluval and the airiness, as well as the moisture and again, airiness of the tree fern, and then the bulk of the fir bark. Thank you for watching. I look forward to sharing more next time.